The ship's captain keeps glancing at you, waiting for some signal that never actually arrives. He clearly expected, like everyone else involved in this assignment, that you would eventually request something extra for yourself. Some small private accommodation senators in your position typically arrange without anyone particularly questioning it. You are Cato. The Roman Senate has sent you to Cyprus to oversee the annexation of the island following the death of its king, and more specifically to manage the disposal of an enormous royal treasury gold, silver, art, and property worth more than most provinces generate across several entire years combined. Every Roman official who has ever managed an assignment remotely like this one has found some way to personally benefit from it. You intend to be the genuine exception. Feel the weight of that intention as you step onto Cyprus for the first time, an island full of administrators and merchants who already assume, based on decades of consistent Roman precedent, that negotiating with you privately will eventually produce some mutually beneficial arrangement, however discreetly arranged. You have brought almost no personal staff with you, a deliberate choice that immediately puzzles the local officials assigned to assist your mission. Most Roman commissioners arrive with elaborate retinues, family members, personal secretaries whose actual function often involves managing the commissioner's private financial arrangements rather than serving Rome's genuine interests. You arrived instead with a small, carefully selected team focused entirely on the actual task at hand, accurately cataloging the king's treasury and ensuring it reaches Rome's treasury completely intact rather than mysteriously diminished through the usual channels of provincial corruption. Epictetus, not yet born, would one day teach that wealth consists not in having great possessions, but in having few wants. You think of this principle now, watching merchants and local officials study you carefully, clearly trying to determine exactly what you personally want from this assignment. Since their entire experience with Roman administration has taught them that every official wants something, the only genuine question being how to discover his particular price. You begin the actual work immediately, personally reviewing inventory lists rather than delegating this tedious task to subordinates who might quietly adjust figures in your absence. You count gold coins yourself on several occasions, a task most senators of your standing would consider genuinely beneath their dignity, recognizing that personal verification eliminates the convenient gaps where corruption typically hides itself within complicated, multi-layered administrative processes. Local officials watch this unusual diligence with evident confusion, occasionally with thinly disguised amusement, clearly unaccustomed to a Roman commissioner actually performing the detailed work his position theoretically requires, rather than simply claiming credit, while subordinates handle the genuine labor. A wealthy merchant approaches you privately one evening, offering what he carefully describes as a token of appreciation for your efficient handling of this complicated transition, a substantial sum that would represent, he explains delicately, simply standard practice between reasonable men conducting reasonable business together. You recognize this immediately for exactly what it represents, the first of what will likely become many such offers throughout this lengthy assignment. Each one testing whether your unusual diligence reflects genuine principle or merely an initial performance that sufficient persistence might eventually overcome. Marcus Aurelius would write, generations after this particular evening, that the best revenge is to be unlike the one who performed the injury. You think of this principle now, recognizing that accepting this merchant's gift would not simply represent personal corruption in some abstract sense. It would actually validate everything Cyprus's local officials currently assume about Roman administration, that genuine integrity exists only as convenient rhetoric, easily overcome through sufficient persistent temptation. You decline the merchant's offer politely but unmistakably, explaining that your role here involves managing this treasury for Rome's actual benefit, not your own personal enrichment, and that accepting his generous token would compromise exactly the careful transparent accounting this transition genuinely requires. He seems genuinely surprised by this response, departing with visible confusion rather than the resigned acceptance you suspect he typically encounters when previous Roman officials eventually decline initial offers, usually as opening negotiation toward larger eventual arrangements rather than genuine, permanent refusal. The work continues across many following months, tedious, exhausting, requiring constant attention to detail that less principled administrators would happily delegate entirely to subordinates while collecting whatever personal advantage their position conveniently allowed. You maintain your own careful personal oversight throughout, recognizing that genuine integrity requires sustained daily practice rather than occasional dramatic gestures of refused bribery followed by quieter, less visible accommodation once initial attention has moved elsewhere. Epictetus would teach that some things are within our control and some things are not, and that wisdom consists entirely in correctly identifying that crucial distinction. You think of this principle now, recognizing that Cyprus's broader administrative culture, the deeply embedded assumption that Roman officials inevitably enrich themselves through provincial assignments, remains genuinely outside your own individual control to immediately transform. What remains within your control is simply your own conduct throughout this particular assignment, your own consistent refusal to participate in that broader corrupt pattern, regardless of how thoroughly it currently characterizes typical Roman provincial administration. A subordinate approaches you one afternoon, clearly troubled, reporting that he has discovered minor inconsistencies in some of the inventory records maintained by local Cypriot officials, discrepancies that could potentially be quietly resolved without drawing excessive attention. Allowing the overall transition to proceed more smoothly without complicating an already substantial administrative burden, you consider his report carefully, recognizing the genuine temptation contained within his proposed solution: simplicity, reduced complications, faster completion of an already exhausting, lengthy assignment. You decide, after careful reflection, that quietly overlooking these discrepancies would represent exactly the kind of small, individually reasonable compromise that eventually accumulates into the larger pattern of provincial corruption you specifically came here to avoid. You instruct him to investigate thoroughly instead, regardless of the additional time and complication this genuine investigation will require, because accurate accounting matters considerably more to you than convenient administrative efficiency. This decision costs you weeks of additional work, weeks you could have otherwise avoided through convenient, quiet accommodation. You do not regret this particular choice, recognizing that the additional difficulty represents exactly the kind of consistent integrity your entire approach to this assignment has always required, rather than some occasional, selectively applied principle convenient only when circumstances happen to make it easy. The treasury eventually reaches Rome completely meticulously documented, every coin and every piece of valuable property accounted for with a transparency that genuinely surprises Rome's own treasury officials, accustomed as they have become to provincial transitions, typically arriving with mysterious, unexplained shortfalls. Senators back in Rome react to this completed assignment with a mixture of genuine admiration and quiet, uncomfortable recognition, since your demonstrated example implicitly highlights exactly how much typical Roman provincial administration has historically diverged from what genuine, principled management could actually achieve. You do not personally profit from this assignment beyond your own ordinary compensation, a fact that becomes increasingly notable precisely because it diverges so completely from typical precedent. Marcus Aurelius would write that very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking. You think of this principle now, reflecting on your completed Cyprus assignment, recognizing that genuine satisfaction throughout this lengthy, exhausting task never actually depended on the considerable wealth that passed continuously through your hands without ever genuinely tempting you to claim any portion of it for yourself. Your satisfaction instead derived entirely from something considerably more durable, the consistent, demonstrated knowledge that your own character remained genuinely unchanged throughout months of constant opportunity for exactly the kind of corruption that typically characterizes positions remarkably similar to the one you just completed. You think of every future Roman official who might eventually study this particular assignment's unusual transparency, recognizing that your example offers something valuable beyond simply this single completed task. Genuine evidence that provincial administration does not actually require corruption as some kind of unavoidable, inevitable feature. The principled, careful management remains genuinely possible whenever someone actually commits to practicing it consistently. This recognition matters considerably more to you than whatever wealth you might have otherwise personally accumulated throughout this lengthy, demanding assignment. If you're listening to this and currently occupying a position where genuine opportunity for easy, convenient corruption regularly presents itself, whether through actual financial temptation or simply the easier path of overlooking inconvenient details that careful diligence would otherwise require you to address, know that Cato once faced exactly this kind of sustained, repeated temptation throughout an entire demanding assignment, and chose consistent integrity anyway. This is why Severus Stoic exists, to bring you these practical, demonstrated chapters of Stoic history, proving that genuine integrity requires sustained daily practice rather than occasional dramatic gestures followed by quieter eventual accommodation. If this story reached something true in you, subscribe to Severus Stoic, so more of these journeys continue finding their way to you exactly when you need them most. Leave a comment below and tell me about a position or responsibility where you faced repeated, sustained temptation toward easier, more convenient compromise, and how you managed to maintain your own consistent integrity throughout that particular extended challenge. Your comments help this channel grow, and they help other people recognize they are not alone in facing genuinely sustained tests of their own character. Cato managed Rome's largest treasury transition in recent memory and emerged from months of constant temptation exactly as personally unchanged as when he originally began. Remember this the next time sustained, repeated temptation toward easier compromise presents itself within your own ongoing responsibilities. You cannot always control how thoroughly corruption surrounds your own particular circumstances. You can always control whether your own consistent conduct remains genuinely, completely your own throughout that entire demanding process.